Right. So I'm going to give a talk that is kind of a mashup between Ember Change Set, which is an add-on for Ember, and showcase something called contextual components. High level, what contextual components are, they are a way for a component to yield behavior or styles or markup or even just raw values up to a consuming component. And this way you can have components that have separate functionality, and you can call one from the other. So I have this all up on GitHub. So if you want, you can go to my GitHub. I'm 0x80ada on GitHub, and you can go to this repo and get the code. So there are 3 branches: master, incremental validation, and incremental validation subcomponent, which are the 3 versions of this app that I'm going to be going through. So this is a talk I gave at my company, Cinch Financial, and Chad was there. So what we were doing is we were building a date picker component, and over time, this date picker needed to have different styling on different pages and slightly different behavior. So it's kind of your typical month, day, year selector. And over time, some pages didn't need the year piece of the picker, and some of them didn't need a day. So we started building multiple different components, and we decided to actually refactor it and try using contextual components. And the idea was that the component would yield 3 separate components back to the consumer, and you could basically pick and choose which of those you wanted to display onto the page. And if you didn't need any of them, you could actually just return a formatted date value from the component. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start on the master branch, which is what I would call like the naive implementation. And then we're going to switch to another branch, which is the incremental branch with some validation. And then we're going to switch to the final branch, which we include another date picker subcomponent, and that component is going to yield values out to the consumer. Along with all that, there's also some goodies that we get from Ember Change Set, which is an add-on. And the way I like to think of Ember Change Set is it's sort of a proxy for your Ember models. And what it gives you is it prevents your Ember models from getting into an invalid state. So, for example, and I'll just jump into it. So here, what you see in gray is a component, and the white is just an Ember route. And that white page is calling something called the credit pull form, which is this gray component. And we have a few fields: first name, last name, and date of birth. And we have some validation in there. So, oh, and if you have questions, just please chime in. I want to make this like more casual. So as you type, I'm running some validation. And this field is bound to the change set, whereas the field below it is bound directly to the model. And what you'll notice, if you look over at the Ember inspector, as I change the change set in the field that's bound to that, you don't really see anything change in the Ember inspector for that data model. But if I go in and I change the model itself, and I change the field bound to that model, then you can actually see the changes happening in the first name field in real time. And this is because they're two-way bound, whereas the change set is not really. There's a proxy involved, and it will only persist those changes when we execute it. So this is what Ember Change Set does, and it's sort of an idea brought over from Elixir. So Elixir is a functional programming language. And in there, the change set does the same thing we're doing here. Is it takes validations, and it will throw errors into this proxy object that you can then render. So if I do like, for first name, if I just do R, then you can see that there was an error thrown. and we can get some information about that error. So I'm going to go through and walk through how this code works. This is kind of the naive implementation. And just at a high level, this is my Vim editor, and I've split it a few ways. So this is the template for the index route. This is the template for my component, and I'm calling that component right here. And the way that this component is being called is using this syntax. Do we have a name for that syntax?
Block.
Yeah, the block syntax. So everything in here is the invocation, and everything inside the block is going to be yielded out. So anything in white is coming from this template out here, which is the route template, and that's what's selected here. And everything that's in gray is being rendered from this Ember component. We pass in a model. We give it a class B, which gives it the gray color. And when we call the component, we give it a name CRF, which we can then use to check its errors. And the reason that we get these errors is that the component yields these errors back up to the consumer. Does anyone get that? Any questions? So it's the basic.
What is the CRF thing called?
I don't know. It's a variable.
Block param.
A block param. Okay, good question. Didn't know that.
I mean, a way to talk about block form components is just that they're like HTML elements, right? HTML elements can have things inside of them, just like your component can have things inside of it. That's really the analogy.
True. Yep. Okay. All right. So we call this component. We pass in a model. I can get into what that model does. So this page has 4 pieces of JavaScript code: 1, 2, 3, and 4. This is the route for the index page. This is the controller for the index page. There's some validations here. I think I'm going to close this because I'll just go over it once. But the validations are the Ember change set validations library. Long story short, we have validations that specify for the first name, you need a minimum of 3 characters and a maximum of 10. Last name is the same. And the date of birth requires 8 to 10 characters, and it must pass this regex, which just requires that you have the slashes in the date. And that stays the same across all 3 versions of this implementation. All right, so the model comes from our route, which we define here in the model hook. And all it really does is when the page runs, the model hook gets called, and we create the credit report record, or the credit report model, and then return it. So when you refresh the page, you'll see that there's an empty credit report model. And if you navigate to a different page, it goes away, because in the deactivate model hook, we get that model and we unload it. If you were not to do this, if you were to get rid of this, then as soon as the page runs, the model hook's called, we create the record, and if you navigate to a different page, that record actually stays on the page. And then when you go back, the model hook's called again, and we create another one. So this is a practice.
A question about what exactly is unload record doing, and how do you make sure the model hook gets called again when you come back into the route?
So the model hook gets called as part of the Ember lifecycle. Mm-hmm. So anytime that the route is activated, the model hook is called as part of the lifecycle, right?
There's a catch, which is a thing I want to change, but it's a larger, which is you can transition to a route by saying transition to and passing the model there. Mm-hmm. And if you already provide the model when you call that transition to, model hook will not run and just use location. But in either case, we have to have a model. So yes, you're right. That always will be.
Right. So in this specific case, it'll always run.
Okay.
In this case, unload record specifically is removing the model that you created from the internet store.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. So deactivate here, deactivate runs when you leave a route. And all this deactivate hook, the reason this is here is because let's say this was a kind of like a CRUD application. And this was like the, like let's say it's a Twitter app, right? And this was like the new tweet page. When you go to this, if you didn't have that model cleaned up at the end, you navigated away. You navigated to the new tweet page, and then you went back to the index. Well, now you'd have two records in the data store.
Mm-hmm.
So unless you were really careful about what you rendered and what the state of those models are, you'd start to see all these empty like ghost records.
Yep.
So we like to clean them up afterwards.
Cool. Thank you.
Any other questions so far? Okay. All right. So credit report form is this component. I'll just briefly touch on this. It has an action, and all it really does is it takes what's in the change set, and when you hit submit, it does some validation, and if the validation looks good, it will just throw an alert. And it'll just say what the contents of the record is.
You're younger than I thought.
Yeah. The validation on the date picker has to be between a certain number of characters. So like 999 is too small. So if you added another character within the valid date range, it'll validate it. So what I'm showing here is the change set has one value and the model has another. And then once you change that value, it should check that the change set's valid, and then it'll persist that information to the model. So
basically, the change set is buffering the input, so that you don't get assume this was the current user or something. You're changing your name. You don't see your name flashing all over the rest of the UI.
Yep, exactly. It'll only appear once it's validated.
Does the deactivate route hook receive any parameters? So like in setup controller, I know that you have access to the controller in the model.
It does receive arguments. I believe it receives a transition, so that you can abort it.
I feel like cleaning up models like that would be a common one, where it's like you might want that in any given.
There is an add-on called Ember route action, I think, and it does basically sets up a thing and activate and deactivate. The problem with deactivate is it has not always the semantics you want. For example, every time your setup controller is called, deactivate is not called, right? So if you go, like say you have post route and you have post/1, you go to post/2, deactivate is not called. Because you're still in posts. So it's not, basically it's just, I think the semantics are fine, it's just not always. If you want to do a thing that is essentially paired with, every time you get a new model, it's similar to setup control. Anytime you do something in setup control, you want to do the inverse of that, you would use reset control.
You unload the model that was sent to the controller.
You could, but I don't think you always want to unload the model. Sometimes, like if you unloaded every model every time, you would be very sad.
Yeah. So like
you have nothing in your store.
if we submitted this record and we saved it, obviously then you don't want to unload it. So you really only want to unload it in the case where the record is like dirty and not saved.
Yes.
So yeah, the template for the component, this is I call it the credit report form. All it is a definition list where we output the change set and the value of the change set for the first name field. Then we do the same for the model, the same for the last name, and then the date of birth. And then we yield up, and this is kind of where we start to use the contextual part of the components. So we use the yield keyword, and we pass it an object. So the hash helper, which we use here, takes keywords, or yeah, I guess they're like
arguments.
named arguments. So this is going to return kind of a, I like to think of it as a JSON object. So it's going to return something that looks like this. Errors, and then there's some sort of array. That's what it will return. In this way, in the consuming template, we get, it defines whatever is yield back to it as a parameter called CRF. And then we can use CRF.errors, which is defined here. We can use that to display the errors. And here, the only thing we really do is if there are errors, means there's like a positive number of some sort, then we just yield or display the number of errors that we had. And because this is part of the index route template, then I give it the class of A, which renders the same white background. So if I get rid of that, you see it's really rendering this from the same template as the index route template. So that's kind of using the block syntax and handlebars and having a component yield data out to its caller. So that's the naive implementation. So at our company, we wanted to have more dynamic rendering of the date picker. So unless anyone has questions, I'm going to go to like the next iteration of this implementation. Okay. So this looks good. It should look exactly the same. The behavior is a little different in that instead of immediately showing feedback as you type, here we're going to change the behavior so that when you focus out, then it will start to update. I'm just going to update my editor. If anyone knows how to refresh all the Vim buffers, let me know.
Colon check time.
Check time?
Yep.
Maybe refresh.
It won't refresh in real time.
What it does is it checks the time, the last write time.
Change the branch.
Oh, interesting.
Oh.
So every time you do
all
it,
the buffers will refresh.
Okay.
I use Ember and it just pops up the files.
yes, if you use it, if you're editing in the terminal though, the way that works is by focus. So if you refocus and refocus the editor, it checks time twice. It calls check time.
The
On Ember,
yes.
the GUI calls check time every time you create. But in this case, he's in the terminal, so it doesn't know.
Yeah.
He's left focus from the editor to
Yeah.
check time. Sorry.
All right. This is what I mean about like casual discussion.
Emacs has a similar thing as well as does. So if you use iTurn2 and tmux, you can get focus events.
You can, and you can also use MacVim in the
It's-
terminal, which is flag.
Okay.
Yes.
You're right, VS Code's pretty radical. The debugger is amazing.
Isn't
The
it, is
debugger
there like
is
an auto
awesome.
command to do that every time that you,
For check time, like to
like a movement or something like that?
you could, but then you're gonna do it a lot more than you need.
Ah, good point.
You can also check the branch out with user name it automatically.
All right. So what I do here. So for this implementation, the model hook does basically the same thing. It creates the credit report model. I set it to a local variable, and then I create a change set. I set the change set, and then I return a model that's a little more complicated. I return the model and the change set because I'm going to be rendering both the values of the model and the values of the change set in the UI. Controller, I think, is the same. Yep. And then the template is roughly the same, slightly different. In now that it has a onValidate function. So the behavior is just slightly different. So if I focus out, it'll show the errors, the last name. It'll show the change set changes in real time, and then when I focus out, it will do the validation. So
Wait, do you control when the validation runs?
you can, yeah.
Like if you want it to be on input, so it runs the validation during typing.
Yeah, it's really up to you to define when the validation
Just remember
occurs.
the action stuff, basically.
Yep. Let's try 999. Yep. So this is very similar implementation, just some of the semantics of when the validation occurs is slightly different. And most of that is in the component itself. Here, the inputs have on blur and on input events, but otherwise it's really the same. So here we still yield up an object with the errors, and the on submit action does the same thing. So you can see here, if I was to do that again, Ron, Adams, once you submit it, we execute the change set, which means we take our proxy object and we persist the changes down to the model. Then you'll see the values appear down in the model. And they also appear in Ember inspector. So this is neat. Change sets are cool because your change set will prevent any errors from ever getting into your model. So it's created by Lauren Tan, I believe. Did you work with her at Dockyard?
I did.
Okay.
She's great.
Yeah. So next we're going to go to the final version, unless people have questions.
Oh, I have a question.
Sure.
Why is there an Ember object create on your top left? With your model and change set framework? Why do you need an Ember object there?
Where?
Ember object there.
Oh, here.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is in the model hook.
Yeah.
So my model that I'm returning is just an Ember object that has two keys, the model and the change set, just because I'm rendering both on the page.
You can just be a Bojo.
There's no reason for he's.
Yeah.
I'm trolling you.
There was a recent post on the Discuss forum. Basically, most of the time, if you're doing Ember object create, you don't need. You can just return the Bojo.
Let's try it.
You don't need an Ember object.
Yeah.
Commonly, folks do that because they have downstream issues with things calling .get on that thing and it doesn't exist. But those are just bugs that you should fix.
Okay.
Very
All right. So this should work now. Let's try 2 characters. Yep.
So the underlying model property and change set properties are what everything else is using, and those are still whatever they were. Right? We didn't change those.
Yeah. Looks good.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I just I like to call it out because I think it's something that people cargo because they don't know when they need an Ember object. And the answer is actually almost never, unless you want to actually use some of the features that gives you, like computer properties.
Yeah. I think I've gotten into the habit of using them.
Yeah. Exactly. That's what I'm trying to bring people.
Okay. Well, I'm definitely down for that.
If you were doing it a million times, also it'd be way faster than just Bojo. Like nothing faster than not doing any work.
Right.
Can you install
You can, but you shouldn't.
How do you do that?
Don't.
I'm
You have
pretty sure I
to
just saw some.
you have to use Ember.define property.
Yeah,
There's a
define
number of
properties.
open issues, but don't do that.
That's private. Define properties.
Don't do it.
You just don't need it.
You can use decorators or something.
I think you'll get it.
the point is, the heuristic is basically every object that create is almost always wrong. Because the only things you can do that are special to the object model would be requiring an extend. So if you want to add a CP to a thing, you call extend. And if you're doing extend, not create or something for a test, that is probably also weirdness, but like it's fine. Yeah. Anyways, we should make a rule for that. Yep.
Okay. So this is this is really like the final version. There's like rough edges and stuff in here, but it's really to demonstrate like really diving into contextual components. So the index template is basically exactly the same. We call the credit report form component. We yield up a white box that shows that there's errors or not from the credit report error handling. The changes in the credit report form component are mostly around the date picker itself. So here we added a new component called date picker. We give it a class C, which just gives it a different color. So you can see it nested, which is the dark gray. So that's this one. And then inside there, the date picker, if it's using the has block, so if we're using this kind of block syntax where you call the component here, and then you include block content inside of it, you can detect that in the component with this has block helper.
Is that a built-in helper?
Yes.
I've always seen it as like camel case has block. I've never seen.
So it was camel case for quite a while. With Ember 2.10, we introduced the dash rise case version. The camel case one will likely be deprecated, but I don't think it's now.
Is that because, is there ever going to be a positional argument to has block where it's like if the user has consumed?
Wonderful question.
Yeah, so if I
You already can do it actually. So if you can ask if it had an else. It only valid other blocks. But with the name block RFC, you can pass many blocks.
Right.
So that thing would happen. But yeah, there is a second one.
So if I just called it like this, like the traditional easy peasy way to invoke a component, then it would actually render just the formatted date, the value that the component produces. And this is just a computer property.
So it just prints the date.
It just prints the date.
That's not elements stuff.
No elements, just a date value. And this formatted date is a computer property defined in the JavaScript side. Otherwise, as I invoke it as a block syntax, it'll do the rest. So it'll do this set of code, which yields, so I use the hash helper again. So this is going to produce a JavaScript bojo or some sort of object. And this defines the fields inside there. So we're going to have a day field, a month field, and a year field. And then finally, a date, which is the same formatted date as down here. It's going to return the model and then a list of errors from a validation. To dive into, you have a question?
No, I'm just mystified.
Okay.
Continue.
So day is the first field we yield back inside this object, and we use the component helper. So what we're actually returning is another component, and we're returning 3 components. And the components are just text fields. We're going to be returning 3 text fields. One represents the day, one returns a component text field for the month, and one for the year. So yeah, basically all this is 3 text fields that we can then use in our credit form component. So here we call it, and then down here we have access to the object itself called date of birth, which represents this hash here. So that gets turned into this variable, or block parameter, I guess you call it.
It sounds like very.
And then we use the DOB variable to inject this component here. So this is just, we're just calling a text field component here. We're going to render it over here. So that's really the contextual components.
That's why I was making that.
And the reason I wanted to make this casual is because I don't know how to articulate this well.
The way to think about the thing on the right is that you're providing a potential curry value that can be used. We don't actually create a component instance until you invoke it. Right? So in theory, it is quite lightweight to provide many possible options that can be used, whether they're actually rendered or not. Right?
Interesting.
You're
I didn't know
also kind
that.
of defining the API of the component. So as you build it, you're saying like, oh, these block parameters have an API. You can document that the day, month, they act as those. You have access to the errors out there.
Yeah, it's fun.
Yeah, I mean, you could also call these, they're in a way, they're child components of the original that the crawler gets to use. And, you know, you can also do this if they were just actual components on the file system. But using the component helper here lets you actually set their settings in advance for the user so that they're wired up correctly with all the actions and all the values and all that.
Yep.
That's really another way to think about it. But
And on the bottom left, you could also theoretically pass additional constraints or additional arguments.
customer already said it.
Like it combines and clouders actually the arguments on the right hand side.
So just to show, we'll start with the date of birth.month. That is this component right here. So we just render a text field component. And then the next one is the date and then the year. And that's just this one, and this one. And what makes this neat is you can just delete these from the consumer. You don't have to touch the component itself. And now you have a date picker that only shows the date and the year, or the day and the year. So this is what we were trying to do at my company, where we didn't want to have to change the component. We just wanted the consumer to dictate what the final layout would be. So it'd be different in a lot of different cases. And we didn't want to have any kind of like conditional logic in the template that says like, oh, you know, they passed in this parameter, like disable the month field, disable the date field, because that gets pretty ugly. So this is a way to do it more declaratively, and it makes the final component a little more flexible.
When you deal with the validations potentially being, like, are you defaulting each of the 3 fields? When you validate, theoretically you're validating the full date, resulting date. So if you only ask for a day and year, it's possible that it's not a valid day unless you put like.
So that was actually really easy to solve in this case because we just didn't do it. But at my company where we actually implemented this, we found like sensible defaults. So.
Sure. I mean, presumably, if you're storing this in a date field somewhere, or even as an integer, you got to do something.
Yeah.
You got to do something.
So what we ended up doing is we added a few just additional parameters that you could tell it to like not validate this field or not validate that field. Do that. Okay. Okay, so we yield all these components out. They have, you know, focus out actions. They have key up events. They have a type, which just it's a an input. So you can say it's a number, a telephone number, email, or whatever. Placeholder, and then a value that it gets from the change set that was passed in. And then we render it over in the consumer. So that just looks like, if we go through it again, do run, we get the validation down below, just as we did before. Change set, say atoms. And then if we change the date, we could do 4, say 25th. 999. So here, validation's more robust in this case, just because previously I was using regular expressions to do the validation on the entire string. So here we can do additional validation on just a single number. So you have a little bit more power there. And what I'm doing here in the inner gray box is we do validation additionally on each number field. So you can say, the month isn't just 2 digits or 2 characters. Now we can say for the month, it can only be the values 1 to 31. Or for the year, it has to be 1,000 to 3,000 or something like that. So you get some additional validation that we can do in there as well.
Yeah, but then your app breaks in your 3,000.
That's fine. None of us will be here then.
I'm glad to do that.
So let me see. Yeah, once it's valid, the other thing we're doing here is we have the formatted date that we yield up, and then our template yields and prints the formatted date down here. And what we get is the consumer, which this is the credit report form template, can actually display the value from the inner component. So not only does it render, or not only does the contextual component yield individual text fields back up, but it can actually yield up the fully formatted value that the component produces on the JavaScript side. And that's how we can do this. So I think overall, contextual components are cool. You can kind of select, you can let your consumer dictate which parts of the component it wants. You can yield values back, you can yield errors back, and it makes the components way more flexible. So this is great for our application that has tons of different uses for the day picker. But this is really powerful for things like Ember add-ons. I learned a lot from Miguel Camba's Power Select add-on, where he uses this where he has tons of consumers using this, and they have different needs for the select dropdown. So he uses contextual components to render that, and it gives whoever's consuming that add-on complete flexibility in what that select dropdown looks like. So, any questions? That's all I got.
Cool. Thanks, Ron.
Hello. So this is going to be a pretty fast talk because I only have 5 minutes. I'm going to talk about Ember, which is an add-on I made that bunch of folks are already starting to use, and I'll give you briefly the problem that it solves, which is sometimes you want to be able to serve a pre-rendered version of your Ember app, right? We have fast boot is the general way that Ember apps can do server-side rendering, and fast boot is great, and it gives you all the infrastructure that made Ember possible. But the very fastest way to pre-render your app is to not do it at all when the user's visiting. It's to do it when you build the app. Right? And you can do that when you've got pages that aren't changing for every user. Right? So if you have an app like that, which is actually, a lot of apps have pages like that, you can use fastboot to render those pages at build time when you make the app and then never do it again. So it's just a static file that you can throw up on a CDN. You can serve it from GitHub pages. You can serve it from anywhere. So I decided to go and find an app that needed this capability. So I went through the list of top Ember add-ons and looked for ones that have their own documentation pages built in as Ember apps in the add-on, because that's a very common pattern. And I found Ember Power Select. So Miguel's going to get a second shout out here. So Ember Power Select has a homepage, and it's really nicely designed. And it also has this joke built in, if you've never noticed, which is because it's about Power Select. So if you keep selecting, it keeps giving you different complaints from the add-on, and eventually it gives up and won't answer you anymore. So that's cool, and we'll take the Ember Power Select website and make it pre-rendered. So, and once it is pre-rendered now, that'll give it better SEO and faster boot when people visit it. So to get started, here I'm cloning his repo. I'm adding all the dependencies. So the steps here are clone, yarn install, Ember.js, and then I have it working, and I see that I have a local copy of the site, and I just make sure that everything's good. So it is. It's totally normal. And so the reason this works, right? Ember Power Select is an add-on, but when you try to run it directly like this as an app, every add-on brings with it a dummy app, which is it's a full-blown Ember app that exists just so you could try out the add-on. And people use them for writing their tests. They often use them for writing their doc sites, which is what this is doing. It's a good pattern. So to add Prember, I'm going to do yarn add dev Prember, and also I'm adding Ember CLI fastboot, which is the standard way you add fastboot to any Ember app. And I'm going to change one thing in my configuration. So in the Ember CLI build file, which is where you're passing options into your Ember app construction, I'm adding one new option called Prember, and I'm saying which URLs I would like to render. And so initially, I'm just picking the home page and the /docs page, because those are two routes that I saw exist in this app. And then I'm going to test my build. And so I'm going to start to run Ember build. And by default, Prember only runs when you're doing a production build. When you run environment equals production. Production builds take a little longer because they run minification and all that stuff. So when I'm testing, I often just set Prember manually on a dev build. So this is a dev build with Prember on. And you can see when it runs, it actually says it pre-rendered the / route and it pre-rendered the docs route. 200 OK, cleaning up, built successfully. And if we look at the HTML files that got built, we now have some ones that weren't there before. So we always had an index.html file, but now our index.html file actually has the content in it. We also now have a docs index.html file that wasn't there before. And we have this empty HTML. And the reason we need it empty is because normally index.html is empty, right? It has no content in it. It's just script tags that serve up your app. And when you download it, there's no content until the script tags run and build all your content. But of course, we've pre-rendered the index.html. It has content in it now. So we need a separate thing to be the empty thing. And that's what _empty is that Prember gave us. So that's good. I rendered 2 of the routes. All right, I have like the /index.html is the home page, and /docs/index is the docs route. But there's a lot of other routes in this app. So rather than try to manually keep track of them in this list here that we made, I'm going to add another add-on called Prember Crawler that I just added. And I'm going to set my URLs to use the crawl function. So URLs can be a function here. And it gets full access to the built application so that you can look at the files on disk, but it also gets full access to a running fastboot server. So you can just call visit any URL, and it will give you back the page. And so what crawl is able to do is it visits a page that you start from. It finds all the links in there, and then it visits those, and it finds all the links. And it keeps going until it can't find any new links that don't leave your site.
What is the initial entry point?
So by default, it just starts with the home page, but that's an option you can pass in here and to have any number, any list. And you can also customize what selectors we're going to use to try to find links and things like that. And so in general, you can write your own function here. It could call crawl. It could add some other things that you happen to know about that crawl's not going to find, stuff like that. So now when we run our build, OK, yeah, this is playing. It's going to find all of the routes in the whole app and render them. And it's writing out HTML files for all of those. So now when our app is built, we can actually go in there and just serve it for the plain old static server and boot it up, and we see that we've got a working app. And that's all great. And we go and turn off JavaScript just to see the difference between, because Ember is still taking over after loading the fastboot content here, right? So the first hit is going to give you the static content, but after that, Ember is going to boot and take over. So any other clicks you make are just going to be normal Ember apps. If I turn off JavaScript, you're actually going to see things. What is the static content coming from the server? So here I'm navigating through the site with JavaScript off, which means all this content you're seeing didn't need Ember running in the client at all. It was all pre-rendered. So some interactive functionality is not there, right? Because Ember, I have JavaScript off. So these dropdowns, for example, aren't doing anything until I turn JavaScript on, and then you can see that Ember does take over correctly. So we did pretty much everything we needed to do in this. There's one last step, which is, so EmberPowerSelect.com is served off of Netlify. You can also obviously serve this kind of stuff off GitHub Pages or any source of static hosting. But in the case of Netlify, there's this file called _redirects that says, what do you do with routes that don't match anything? If somebody tries to visit a URL that isn't a file, what happens? And traditionally with an Ember app, you'd say unknown things should just render the index.html, right? That was your empty page that will handle any route. But in our case, that's not true anymore because we now have content in our index.html. So if somebody visits some random URL that is in fact a route in your app that we just didn't happen to pre-render, you still want them to get the right thing. So they need to get empty. So the change is to switch the redirect so that unknown routes will get handled with empty.html. And so after I've built for production, I can take and I tested this on Netlify because I know that's where Ember PowerSelect deploys to. So I grab my dist folder that I built, I upload it to Netlify. I go and click on it and I check it out and I see that it's all running. It all looks like it's good. And as a final check, to make sure that my redirect is working, I take a look at what happens if you hit a URL that's not pre-rendered. Right? What we want to see is an empty, the traditional empty index.html page come back, and that's what we get here, which means that's going to give a chance for Ember to boot up and render anything that we didn't pre-render. It'll still have a shot to do it. Right? So you can pre-render some of your routes and not all of them, and they'll still work okay. And we confirm that that works here. So that means the whole thing's done. And this is a real PR I filed on Ember Power Select that fully fast boot renders their whole app. And so if this gets merged, it'll just work. That's it.
Cool.
Yeah.
I did not come in under 5 minutes. But
Huh?
I did not come in under 5 minutes.
You were
That was
close,
okay. It was
though.
okay.
But you're within 5 minutes of when I was like, oh, maybe I should watch my clock.
All right.
So we have, if you want to take a couple questions,
Sure.
then we'll take just a couple in
Yeah,
between
sure.
each person.
Yes.
The crawl functionality, could that also be used to generate like the site-manifest.xml files that Google?
Yeah, you could do that. I think, yes, you absolutely could. I'd have to think about how to feed that back into your actual built site. Like the current crawl functions, you could probably reuse that library I just showed, Ember crawl. All it really needs is a fast boot server. You pass it the visit function that visits things, and it'll keep crawling until it can't find anymore, and it'll give you all the URLs it found. So you could probably call that yourself from another plugin that actually then writes the sitemap file. Yeah. And you would write that plugin a lot like Ember's internals, just the way it hooks into the rest of Ember's build. So one of the things about it is that it's doing all this as part of the normal build process, right? It's not a separate step where you build your app and then you do something special when you deploy it. It's actually done during the build. And the nice thing about that is now whatever you were already doing to deploy probably still just works, right? Because like you just run build, it has more files in it than it used to, and you still take those files and ship them however you used to ship them, probably using something like Ember Style Deploy or uploading to a CDN or whatever it is you do. That should just still work with potentially very minor tweaking, like making sure that it will actually upload all the HTML files that got generated. So yeah, I think you could reuse the crawler and do a similar thing. Yeah.
Awesome.
One more question? Anybody?
I have one, but I should be last.
Okay, you could go.
Have you tested this with rehydration?
So I really wanted to test this rehydration, but I didn't get to it last night.
What is?
So rehydration. So I should define that. But so as of new versions of Ember, like Ember 3.1, like do you need Canary? Yeah. Okay.
3.2 is beta.
Okay. So as of current Ember beta, you can experiment with turning on rehydration, which is the word for. So when we run a site like this in Fastboot, and I can go ahead and just actually do it. Like those were all screencasts, but I have it all here. When a site like this is running in Fastboot, when it loaded, you didn't see anything bad happen, but there is unnecessary work going on. And in fact, if you look closely, there's actually a subtle bug here, which is kind of a fun aside. If I could spend 2 minutes on teaching you something crazy about browsers, you see the little content jumping here when I refresh the page. That's because the page renders the first time with the content from the Ember rendered. It's just HTML, and then Ember boots up, and when it does, it tears down the whole DOM that was there and makes it again. So you end up paying the cost of rendering everything, even though it was already there. And if your page was very expensive to render, you might actually see it flash or something like that. Most of the time, it's not even very visible. On slower mobile devices, it kind of matters a lot more. Because especially if you started scrolling them and you were like in the middle of scrolling, when the Ember app booted up, it would jank. It would like stutter and feel bad. So rehydration solves that problem by making Ember smart enough, the Glimmer rendering engine in Ember smart enough that when it boots, it'll see that there's content already there that was set up to be reused, and it won't have to redo it. It'll just say, I already rendered that, it's good. And it'll only change things that actually differ. Like it'll do corrections if the state is different based on what you did in the pre-rendering and what the state is now. It'll actually fix it. But it'll only change the things that change. That's rehydration. It's possible to do in Ember 3.2. I want to test with that. It should work fine. Like this is all just stock fastboot. It's just running fastboot ahead of time. The weird thing that's going on here with the jumping content is because browser parsers for HTML have a lot of history to them because people started making browsers before there were any specs, and they just started adding features that sounded good to them. And now we do actually have specs, but those specs had to codify all the traditional behaviors that browsers do. So one of those is that a pre-tag, which is what Miguel is using here, if you have PRE, the pre-formatted thing, if you have a new line after pre, there's a special exception that says it doesn't count. It gets stripped from the resulting DOM. That's just a special exception to parsers. And so when you load the page from fastboot, it does that and it strips the new line out because the browser is parsing your HTML. When Glimmer parses your template, it also runs an HTML parser, but it's a different one that we wrote. And it didn't have the exception, so it leaves the new line in. So I have filed the PR that fixes this in simple HTML tokenizer.
How did you know that?
How did I know
You
this?
saw it jump. You saw it jumping, and it drove me crazy. And it
Correct.
spent many hours
Yes.
before it was spent.
It was a couple hours. It's a couple hours.
Not so much.
This is the second time I have found this class of bug. So I was a little bit familiar with where to go. This is the PR.
Nice.
And so like I haven't actually tested it on the app because you'd have to like
It's quite annoying.
take simple HTML
You have
tokenizer,
to build three
use it to
things.
build Glimmer, use Glimmer to build Ember, use the custom Ember to build your app. I haven't tested that yet. I'm pretty confident this fixes it, and I wrote test cases in this library. So like simple HTML,
Do you link this guy?
I do. I do from the code. I know. I gotta stop. I'm running out of time. But yes, I linked to the spec in the PR here.
It's your fault, Jen.
Oh man, I said
You
two
did say
questions.
questions.
I said two.
And there you go. So now you learned something extra about HTML parsers and how Ember reacts to them, because Glimmer, when it parses your templates, is running an HTML parser so that it knows how to build everything up in the DOM, and it doesn't go through the parser again, right? It doesn't just splat a bunch of HTML on the browser. It calls like create element, set inner text to this, and so it has to do the same thing the parsers do. So once in a while we find gaps still, and there's a lot of weird little corner cases because of all the bug handling and error handling stuff that browsers do. Most times when you write a parser that just like gives up when something's invalid, but browsers can't and don't, right? They have elaborate rules for how they guess what you really meant when there's invalid stuff. So there's a lot of cases like that. Okay, I will be done. Next person.
Thank you.
So hi, I'm Mandy. I work with Jen at BioBright, and we do designy things and front-end developer things. And I'm pretty new to Ember, just FYI. This is one of the first Ember apps I've built, so this will be more like a wholesome story about what I learned and what's so great about the Ember community and really helpful Ember features. So yeah, and as you can see, okay, from the screen, so what we built, there's two functionalities. One function is, so our target audience was scientists, and a lot of times scientists are doing complicated experiments and they want to record notes, but their hands are busy. So we built this thing that you can activate by saying Darwin, and it'll transcribe whatever you're saying, the audio, and then it'll store it in this message. And this is the message archive, so your messages will just keep piling up via an each helper, which takes in the message model and then puts it on the screen. And then we also have this thing, which this was built because we know that a lot of scientific words are hard, and what we're using to transcribe speech might not get things like bedpan pontoon, or just like really complicated weird phrases, or like polycarbonate crowns. So in this box, you can add in phrases. It does better if you add like a full sentence, so it does context. So you can add stuff there. So if I say, let's say I say Darwin, please take a note that we need to order bedpan pontoons and polycarbonate crowns. So you can see that pretty well. This is because we already have some speech biasing. So we've already put in phrases that like bedpan pontoon and polycarbonate crowns. So it does pretty well. But let's say I do. Really excited that it works. Darwin. My name is Mandi. So my name is spelled with an I, but it gets it as a Y because that's the more common way of spelling Mandi. But if I say, let's see, my name is Mandi. So Darwin. My name is Mandi. Yeah.
Wait,
So
so
then,
when we tried Tomster, I wanted to try Tomster.
Oh, yeah,
to
for
see
sure.
If that would work.
yeah. Also, part of this is if anyone wants to come up and like try it and feel, it's kind of like our confessional thing where we say like, Darwin, what am I doing with my life? So Darwin, do you know how to spell Tomster?
Oh, he already knows.
There he
mind.
knoes.
Look at that.
Right, that's
So-
pretty good.
What are you using for the speech recognition library on the back end?
So,
Computers. Computers.
yeah, so-
Ah, damn it.
So I can give like a high level structure of how we built this. I'm not allowed to say more because my team will kill me. But it involves knowing, so WebRTC, which lets you stream audio and video for the browser. And then we did like a lot of custom code with different libraries, and we use a third-party vendor to do the speech transcription. So yeah.
That was mostly my question, whether it's third party or if there's like an open source library.
Yeah. And then I can go over a bit how we did the phrase ad biasing. That was the part that me and another person on my team built and toiled over. And also we consulted the Ember Slack and someone responded within like 20 seconds and solved all our problems.
Hopefully they were nice.
They were very nice,
Applause.
yeah.
Oh, well. Yeah,
But I don't know, maybe it was nice, maybe it was like mean, but I was just like, you've solved all my problems.
Awesome.
Yeah, so when you put in phrases, and you press enter, that calls a function which processes the text and like removes any like typos or spaces. And then it adds it to an array in our speech service, and then the speech service is able to feed it to this third-party vendor, and then it delivers the transcript back and then displays it in the, oh, it's still going. It displays it in the message archive. So that's pretty cool. And one lesson that we learned the hard way was, so you can see that some of the texture is highlighted, and it's based on what phrases or words we've put in, or yeah, what phrases or words we've put in to bias it. And the text itself is a highlight helper that actually Jen made. And so it knows what to highlight because the text that it's displaying is a computed property. So the computer property takes in this array of phrases to be highlighted that bias, the transcription. And we didn't know about the array key, which we found out by asking the Ember Slack. That was a lesson that we learned. And things that were really helpful through building all this was definitely like when you add classes and you can use the if helper. So that was really helpful in tracking states. So when Darwin is activated or inactivated, that's really important for user experience. So it was really helpful to change the class based on whether transcription is happening. And yeah, I think the community was also really helpful, which is cheesy to say, but I said this is going to be a wholesome story. So yeah, that's pretty much it. If anyone has questions, yeah.
Does the array helper mean when you, in a computer, when you're listening to dependencies or whatever they're actually called, doing like something dot and then square brackets? That array?
Yeah, the array key. Yeah, like when you do like Ember.computed and then you feed in the dependents, and then I think if it's like an array that's constantly being watched, like we didn't know that an array key existed, so we were like, why isn't it taking in like these new things that we're adding in via this box? Yeah, it was really confusing, but then we found out, and now our lives are better for it. So, yeah. Any other questions, or if anyone wants to try it?
If we can do that after though, because I want to make sure that we get through.
Oh, yes.
We got 3 more talks. We don't want to be here too late.
Yeah, but thank you for listening.
All right, everybody, I want to introduce Tom, who's going to tell us about
Catch Ultimate.
Yeah.
So this is my app. It's called Catch Ultimate. It's a game tracking app for Ultimate Frisbee. The idea is to eventually turn it into a mobile app, which is not. It's weird trying to do that with Ember, but I'll solve that problem later. So the idea is someone is on the sideline during an Ultimate Frisbee game, inputting how the game is going, and then just by a few simple clicks, they're able to track data in Ultimate game. So for those of you who don't play Ultimate, it's played 7-on-7, and then if it's a co-ed game, it'll be 4 men and 3 women. So these 2 sections here, this is your bench and this is your field. The men are colored blue and women are colored white. And then this is your field section, kind of split again by gender, so you can kind of see it better. And that is set up through 4 iterations of the same component, a player list component. And that is broken down with computer functions. So this is a pretty simple example of using computer functions, but I really like computer functions because it's very efficient. So we start with players, and then we filter by gender. Pretty simple. Filter players by gender is M or F, and then we split into bench and field by the on-field property, true or false. And then that makes it very easy to pass in the data to, this is bench men, bench women, field men. And then all I have to do to move people back and forth is a action that toggles their on-field property. So it's very lightweight and very easy to manipulate. So that's one of my favorite things about Ember's computer functions. And the other thing I'll cover really briefly is it's built with Ember Paper. So Ember Paper is a wrapper for Google material design. And that's a grid system that's a little different than Bootstrap. So everything is set up as a column or a row. So you can see the main area is a column. And then underneath that, we have several rows. The scoreboard is a row. This area is a row. And then this area is also a row. So it's a row of columns. So we have a spacer column here, and then 3 other columns are flex 25s. So the flex systems is built in numbers like 5, 10, 15, 25, 33, all the way up to about like I think 80 something, customizable, and then open flex, which just takes with the rest of the space. So I've been using Ember Paper for about a year, and I really like it because it's very easy to take a design and turn it into reality with very little CSS. There's almost no CSS based on margin or padding or positioning, which I'm a huge fan of. And so I'm also a big fan of Ember Paper. Go check it out. And that's everything.
Is the wrapper, or is it Ember Paper, whatever it's called?
Mm-hmm.
Does it give you components that you can use, or you just add the CSS classes to your?
There are lots of components to it. So it has basically all stuff from like material. This is what you're asking, and then you can add in to other to it.
I've never seen the filter by computed before. It's actually really cool. If you were to have a computed, so I'm assuming that the filter by underneath the hood is a computed that listens for changes on the contents of the array itself.
It's roughly like men.addEach on field. So on line 10,
Yep.
you could expand that filter by into a regular computed by saying computed, add a dependent key, of men.addEach.onField.
Okay, got it.
And then you have to like get it, each iterate, and calculate your final value.
If you have a computer that relies on that or something that is a computer that uses the filter by, do I need to observe the contents of that computer anymore, or will it?
No, as you see here, men is a filter by, and benchman, I think is what it is. I can't read it, sorry. It's small. It depends on men, right? So it automatically, like it's turtles all the way down. This is chain nodes. This is like a chain crazy
filter. It's like alias to filter.
It's great. Older versions of Ember ended up doing way too much notification for those, but current versions are much better.
If I didn't want to use the @each or the square bracket syntax for adding a computer that depends on the contents of the array, it potentially set up another computer that's just a filter by, and then
but filter by literally is an expander. Like it literally returns Ember.computed the first argument .@each the second argument. Like it literally, so it's not.
So if you're just like disgusted by typing @each, you could do that.
It is literally using @each internally. Like it uses @each. @each is a fundamental part of the programming model. Don't avoid it just because.
Well, I'm just saying, if people don't know about @each or the square bracket syntax, then I don't know.
So filter by is a great way to avoid typing extra boilerplate. Like if you didn't do this with filter by, you would have to do the @each thing, like I said, but also in the body of the function, you have to get the array, loop over the array, and filter. Right? That's all a bunch of ways.
What I'm saying is a computer that depends on a computer that is using a filter by doesn't have to listen to the contents of it because the computer itself will update.
Yes.
Which is helpful for people.
Correct.
If they don't understand or are not familiar with the square bracket syntax.
The whole idea is that the dependent keys are basically the things you should worry about, right? So in benchman or fieldmen, the only thing he has to look at is the men computer. He doesn't have to care how it's figured out. In this case, it is also a filter by. It's figured out, depends on players or something. But yeah, you don't have to think about all the other details. Yeah. That is, I think, the point.
Use a cellular phone.
That's the goal, but I don't know how to get there once I'm ready to get there.
You're close already. I mean, you can certainly make this just be an app on the web, or if you want to make an actual app, use Ember, use
Corbett.
Yeah, Corbett. Which will package it up as a App Store app using your Ember app. And if you want to style it all nice, Nick Schott also gave a nice Ember talk about making real mobile apps on Ember apps, look, feel native. Totally doable. Yeah.
Also, the latest as far as supporting service workers, not that far from having just use the app.
Yeah.
Cool. Is there a backend piece?
Not yet. The front end MVP is almost done, but shows a little more. We see how it's once it's done, you can. Yeah. So this would be like the history of the game so far. So every blue point is scored by spam, and every purple point was scored by a purple trick.
That's cool.
And you can track. Yeah, you can give people gold stars or boos if they do something good or bad.
Cool. Thank you very much.
Yeah, so I'll start off with an introduction. My name is Keith Williams, and I'm a software engineer at Salsify. I also work on a team with Denny Hadley over here. You guys have all met him earlier. We work on the syndication side of the platform together, and our team really likes beards and hats. So I'm going to talk to you guys about cells today, lots of them, and not these types of cells. I'm going to talk to you about cells in tables. The component I'm going to talk to you about is called incremental table. It's kind of a working name. It succinctly describes what we're doing here, but it's not the most markety of terms. So we're working on that.
Increment table.
No.
So yeah, if y'all have names suggestions, I'll take them. Put them in a hat. Maybe we'll draw out of them. But incremental table is a table. much like Excel, or if you guys have used a product called Airtable, or Google Sheets. It renders it renders a table, but it only renders the important bits. It renders what the user can see, and it does so using a technique people will refer to as like occlusion rendering or DOM virtualization. Basically, you only want to render the things that are visible, that are in the scope of what the user's looking at. And the reason for that is often you want to render many, many, many cells, and you don't want your browser to slow to a crawl when you're doing that and trying to scroll. So I took some of the ideas from this library off of a couple of other Ember add-ons that exist. Incremental table is kind of like Ember collection, kind of like Ember table, which folks at Adapar worked on. Smoke and mirrors, and a few others, like I mentioned earlier, Airtable, Google Sheets. A lot of them have implemented these ideas of DOM virtualization or occlusion rendering. So you might be asking yourself, if all these existing add-ons are out there already, why reinvent the wheel? Well, the reason is, and I might be sued for libel or slander by saying this, but I don't think any of the add-ons that are out there today actually solve our problems. At Salsify, we have a couple of tables that we need to render that are not only really, really long, have many, many rows, they're also really wide. They have thousands of attributes, and as a result, we need to be able to scroll and display content really efficiently in 2 dimensions. And so we had to reinvent the wheel here and build this add-on from scratch. So without further ado, I'll give you a demo. I don't want to do a live demo because that's stressful. But here it is.
Pretty pictures.
It's a table. Any questions? But in all seriousness, let's get into it. This is where we're using incremental table in our app. Basically, you can see we're scrolling around here. This is an ambitious application. We want to scroll around and we want to edit text. We want to be able to display different content. We've got tooltips here. We've got overlays. We've got all these images that are being rendered. You can open up modals from here. So let's look at actually what's going on under the hood. Here you can see we're scrolling through that initial table that I was showing you, and you can see what's being updated in the DOM. So one of the techniques we used in order to save on performance is actually reusing components, reusing DOM. We are updating the position of rows, we're updating the position of cells and their sizes and their content, but we're not actually adding or removing them from the DOM. So we save a lot of time rendering by doing that.
Do you control the rows?
Yes.
So you guarantee that the rows don't do anything in your init that is going to be a problem. You have state bleeding, right?
Yep.
Or you could.
You tend to, yeah. So I'll get to that. There's some caveats.
Sorry.
It's all right. Good question.
That's a very cool demo.
I
like the flash.
So here is a little bit zoomed in. This is actually one of the cells, and you can see basically if you go back and look, one of our columns, you see all these dates being rendered on the left-hand side of the table. Here you can see this is one of the date cells. You can see again all the way down the DOM tree. None of these divs are being replaced. Nothing's being added or removed. Attributes are being updated and content is being updated. So it's pretty efficient in terms of the way it updates things. And you see a version of it even with pretty complicated DOM, even with an ambitious application which has pretty complicated components. You can see flashing in the DOM, there's an I tag there that flash. There's a couple divs that flash because their content is being updated, but nothing's being added or removed. This is in contrast to an application that I took a lot of inspiration from, which is Airtable. You can see on the right, all of these rows are being added and removed, and as a result, you can see when you scroll up rather quickly, you've got to repopulate the DOM, and you've got to it takes a little bit of time to fill everything in, even though the content isn't all that complicated. And they're using React. So. What's up?
If it was just raw HTML,
yeah,
would this be a problem? If they're wide and long?
Yeah, it would.
with no kind of like JavaScripty stuff?
Yeah, the reason is that, I still have a lot to learn about performance in the DOM and rendering and painting. But essentially, when you're scrolling through a ton of content, the browser's repainting it all. And if you take, for example, an app like Slack, if you just scroll up forever in history, like it keeps loading things, it never unloads any DOM. And even though there's not a lot of like, it's not responding to scroll events unless you hit one of those boundaries at which it needs to load more content. But even as you're scrolling, the more content you have loaded, the slower that scrolling is going to be because of all of the work the browser is doing in order to keep rendering.
Just having the browser render a million rows horizontally and vertically will take a very long time. If you just send like no JavaScript content, just send HTML table with a million rows in both directions, or rows with millions of columns. It's going to take quite a while to just render. Oh, just to stream content.
That's
is
like
large.
downloading
The memory pressure is probably the worst thing about it. Yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot of reasons why having just tons of DOM in your browser is going to slow things down. So Robert, as you brought up earlier, like you mentioned, you have some like bleed between rows, right? Do we have control over the rows? One of the biggest challenges we've run into with this add-on is components are reused, right? If you guys have ever experienced, implementing a controller and you're navigating around the app, you go from, blog posts /1 to blog post /2, and there's a bit of content there that you expected to have gone away. Say your blog, the second blog didn't have an author, but now you're seeing the author from blog 1. You're like, okay, why is this still around? Well, if you don't set up your computers correctly, if you have any derived state from, in a controller, because it's long-lived, that state is just going to stick around unless it's replaced. We have the same problem now with components. All of the cells that are rendered in this table, they're relatively long-lived because they're being reused. So you have to be really careful with derived state, meaning components or observers if you use those. There's a workaround. Basically, our recommendation for consuming this add-on is to keep your state and all of your derived state as high up as possible. Like compute it in the serializer when you're deserializing your models, or compute it in the controller component that's like invoking the incremental table. Don't compute it on the cell itself. And that has the added benefit also of meaning that when your cells are rendering, when you're actually scrolling through the table, you're not incurring that additional performance hit in JavaScript runtime. Another caveat is that expensive components can still lead to expensive rendering. If there's some things we're doing in our implementation of this table where, for example, we have some we have icons that you'll hover over and they have tooltips, right? All those tooltips are actually in the DOM before you hover over them. They're just hidden. But as you're scrolling through, even though you're not hovering over these things, they're still being rendered. So it's still easy to shoot yourself in the foot. You still have to be very conscious while you're using this. It's not just a one size fits all silver bullet. On a more personal note, because Jen told me to talk about this. This project was a lot of fun. I learned a lot from this. I learned a bit about the Ember run loop, the JavaScript event loop. I learned about performance optimization. I spent a ton of time just digging around in the Chrome dev tools, and a lot of time like playing around with different implementations of this, trying to figure out what I could do to speed things up. And I still have, there's still plenty of room to go on optimization. So a lot of learning ahead. Is it okay? So what's going on in the future? Gotta come up with a better project name. I hope you guys can help me out with that because I'm not that great at naming things. Maybe open source the project. I'd love to get some more collaboration on this. I'd love to work with people who have developed libraries that are, that perform better, that like Ember Table or Smoke and Mirrors, any of the projects that I mentioned earlier, Ember Collection. and better support for paging in 2D. So what I mean by this is we have support for paging in data from a server, for example, in one dimension. We have pretty good native support for pulling in data and loading it incrementally in when you're scrolling vertically. But the configuration for columns, like the interface for how you define which columns are going to be rendered, is pretty static. It's really similar to the way that Ember Tables operates. And what that means is when you're loading in your data, you have to load in like, your whole row all at once. And if your table's super wide, which philosophically this add-on is supposed to support really wide tables, you're still going to incur a pretty bad performance hit there. And performance is a huge thing. So if you compare the scrolling performance, I brought up Airtable earlier, so I would look really good next to it. But the performance is like still not there. Like Ember Table scrolling through this pretty much same implementation. Like you're not seeing the flashing, you're not seeing any lag really. Like it's a lot smoother, and so there's still a lot of room we have to go as far as performance goes. That's all I've got for you. Any questions?
Yes. So do you have like a bucket list of performance improvements from Ember Table, or just that you know about that you just haven't had time to prep for this?
I did. Yeah, I had a bucket list of like the big things to check off, like reusing components. I kind of worked through those, and now it's just going to be, I think, it's going to be a slog. It's going to be like just a lot of small performance tweaks, as far as I can tell.
What do you think Ember Table is doing that makes it so much, well, at least in this instance, that much faster?
Good question. So Ember Table, as far as I know, there's not a version of it that works on like any Ember version after like 2.2 or something, or like early 2.0 versions. And the version that I'm looking at now, this is on their docs, this is on their like example site. It only works with Ember 1.0. And the reason is that they're using views, and I think they're like taking advantage of the way that views are rendered to get some performance gains. But to be honest, no, I don't really like have a great understanding of what they're doing that's allowing them to have this performance.
Yeah.
What's up, Danny?
Does it support locking columns? So if you scroll horizontally, columns on the left can be locked so that the user still has context about it if you scroll horizontally.
Great question. I have a plant in the audience. Yeah, so it does. That's one of the cool parts of this. Let me see if I can find that slide. Boom. Yeah, so as you can see here, like you can scroll up and down in the couple of columns, like the internal product info, which might be a little small to read, but basically the couple of columns on the left are gonna stay frozen. You can actually kind of have like a configurable number of frozen columns, frozen headers that are gonna like be locked in place relative to the other scrolling that you're doing, which is I think kind of a cool feature. One thing I didn't mention was like one of the questions that Jen was asking, what are you most proud of about this add-on? And I would say the interface. Aside from the fact that 2D paging wasn't implemented already like natively, like I've built a lot of tools and libraries and things that I'm not like immediately super proud about the interface. I'm like, oh, I built this, and I'm like, oh, this already needs to be refactored. When Jenny and I like put this add-on together, we thought a lot about the interface, and looking at it, I'm like, oh, okay, like all of the styling that I need to do can be done. All of the customization that I need to be able to do can be done. But we didn't go too far on it. Like we could have essentially like tried to build Excel and try to pack all of the features of Excel into this, like, arrow key navigation and cell selection, and we didn't go overboard. I think we kind of found a happy medium there.
So in this slide, you're saying the Ember table on the left is using what version of Ember, and on the right is using.
Yeah, this slide.
Yes.
So this version of Ember, this is one that's on their docs website. I believe this is.
I mean, if it's running Ember, you can right-click inspect, go to Ember.version.
Yeah, true. Let's check that out.
Sorry, I'm not trolling you. I'm just saying that you might be trolling yourself.
You are right. So yeah, it's a
I'm sorry.
112-2.
Ooh.
Yeah.
The
So-
last fast one over.
The most recent builds of Ember Table do run against Ember 2.8.
Okay.
So they try to run against Canary and Beta, and they were passing, but those are only current at 3.0 Beta 2. So you might take a look and compare. The reason I ask is because there are certain, like until Ember 2.10 or 2.11, and almost all the Ember 2Xs were slower in some respects than Ember 1.12. So specifically, Adapar stayed on Ember 1.12 because they have this constraint of massive amounts of data and rendering, and the versions were slower.
Right.
That's no longer true, and that's why they're like working very hard to upgrade.
Mhm.
But so you should, I suggest that you should make sure that you're not trolling yourself by checking your add-on against a version of Ember that's like known to be slower than the version they're testing.
Gotcha.
It may not necessarily be a thing they're doing there. It's faster.
Good to know.
So, do you have kind of like a personal desire to work on this from a performance standpoint, or is the organization like, oh, this is a performance problem, we want to prioritize?
It's a little bit of both. Performance is, well, it has been becoming more of a passion of mine since I've been working on this project. We kind of had the requirement of needing to render like a pretty large table, both, it's pretty long, really wide. And like I said, none of the add-ons I could find out there were going to support that use case in the current version of Ember that we're on. So building this from scratch was a necessity, and we've come to different points at which our cell components are becoming more complicated and more difficult to render, and which we've had to reevaluate and say, oh, this isn't performant enough. Let's like start going back down that rabbit hole and see how much performance we can eke out of this thing. That answers your question.
Great.
One more. Is it okay?
It's almost 9 o'clock. Is it real fast?
I think it's fast. I don't know if it's fast.
Maybe let's wait till after.
Seems good.
Okay, cool. Because I want to make sure we still get Dan in. So thanks, Keith.
Let's wait until, let's see that like the starting message is there. And we wait, and we wait, and we wait, and the test just never finishes running. It's just hanging there forever. And it turns out you've run into the famous Ember concurrency timer loop. Ember concurrency is not the only way to run into this, but it's where people seem to run into it most often. Essentially, when you say await click, the test isn't going to continue until everything that Ember knows about is going to happen has happened. And since we have a loop where we're polling to find out what stuff is going on and Ember is aware of that, there's always something new happening. And you could imagine trying to get in here and saying like, okay, well, I know there's a Mirage model that's backing this up. Let me go edit that so that the polling loop will actually complete. Except that as long as we have a wait click there, we're never going to have control returned to us. So, okay, the polling is the problem. We can do this gross thing that I think most people have done at least once and just say, well, let's just completely change our behavior in testing. That's a great idea, right? Woo!
Yeah.
Not only is this not a great idea, but it also doesn't actually fix our problem because we skipped the polling, but we're still waiting for everything to settle. So we've gone all the way straight ahead to done. We're still not actually getting to look at our starting point.
And you can't test the intermediate states.
Exactly. So what we're really stuck on here is exactly what Rob just said, is you want to be able to kind of jump into your app and say like, okay, move on until I get to point X and then stop the world. Let me make my assertions, let me go tweak my Mirage models, do whatever I want to do, and then kind of pick up where things left off. And so that's where this idea of milestones came from. And we spent a while internally kind of playing with different interfaces for this API, trying to come up with ways that were both lightweight and easy to kind of annotate your app code while still letting you do what you need to do from testing. So the only difference between this and the snippet that I posted earlier is this milestone wrapper that you can hopefully see is a little bit highlighted there. Essentially, where we were just calling pollJob.perform, now we've wrapped this in an annotation. We're giving it a name. We're saying like, hey, this is tagged. This is my component's pollJob milestone. And by default, this does nothing at all. Whenever you hit that code in your app, it's just going to immediately invoke that callback that you give it, and things move on. But what we can do in our tests is say, okay, for this test, I care about the my component pollJob milestone. So we're going to add this setup milestones call. And what that does is it means anytime that milestone is hit, the world is going to stop. And we're going to have the opportunity to take stock of where things are at and impact what's going to happen when things actually continue. So here, we're no longer awaiting the click. We're just calling it and then letting things kind of continue however they want. And we're saying await advance to that milestone. And what's going to happen is the moment that milestone is hit, so the app code actually hits it, that's going to pause and our test is going to pick back up. And so if we actually complete our test implementation now, if we keep the return value of that await, that gives us a handle that we can use to actually do things with the milestone. So here we're going to say, okay, wait till we get to the beginning of the polling. We check the text. We say, cool, it's starting, great. And then we say, okay, great. Instead of actually going and doing any of the polling, just immediately return from that. And then we verify that the text is done. And in fact, our test passes. This is nice in that it lets us avoid timer loops. It also means that it's easy to stub things that are slow. So if you have like animations that are run and you've got timers that are kind of synchronized with that, or you're just generally doing anything that like, okay, a user has done some interaction, we want to just show a message for a certain amount of time and then continue on. This gives you a way to sort of jump over that in your tests without having to put test knowledge into your actual application code. The other kind of fun bit with this is that, okay, say we actually want to do at least a little bit of error handling and catch like, okay, if the polling fails for whatever reason, this is now super easy to test without getting in the business of like changing your Mirage config so that the endpoint returns a failure or something. We can just say, okay, we're going to advance to that same point, and instead of returning, we're just going to throw an error, and we can verify that the message from that error shows up in the tests. So we rolled this out. It's an add-on called Ember Milestones. Essentially, anytime a milestone is hit, you can return a value, throw an error. If you've got Ember concurrency installed, you can just cancel it. Or you can also say, actually continue, like go ahead and invoke the callback, do what you were doing before. I just wanted to pause and check things out first. So it avoids timer loops. It lets you speed up your tests. In just a super naive pass over one of our test suites, we shaved a little over a quarter off the runtime. It's a little bit more deterministic than things like polling, and it's stripped out in production builds, so there's no cost to your actual shipped application. That's it. Questions?
So you said that you didn't document it very much. There's actually an add-on, call it Ember CLI add-on docs that you might want to check out.
Really?
Yeah.
That's cool. What does it do? I've never heard of that.
It's like a way for Ember add-ons to have like document.
It's actually funny you should bring that up. In one of these tabs that's open, I've been this Milestones is all written in TypeScript, and I've been working on a TypeScript integration with add-on docs and using this as a way to, I know, I'm sorry, Rob, just plug your ears, la la la. I actually caught several bugs in converting it to TypeScript, so I'm sorry, but it is what it is.
It's okay. We're not all writing perfect code.
Yeah, that's what it is. We can't all be you. The rest of us need some help. Something has to hold our hand.
Are you actually going to add documentation?
I am, yes. There is a README that just says like to do fill me out right now. And in that repo, there's actually a docs branch where I filled out the README partway and then got to sections I didn't feel like writing, so I stopped. And now I've been using this TypeScript add-on doc stuff as a way to continue to procrastinate writing the docs. But sometime in the next week or two, I'm hoping to actually wrap that up.
Sounds great.
Cool. You guys are already on the Ember 3.0 testing setup hooks related.
Yes, yeah.
That's awesome.
You can do that on older Embers.
Yeah, there's no reason not to do it in older. It works back to Ember 2.4.
Oh, really?
You just need to do enough like Ember CLI QE in it.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe some ES like config to make your ES happy.
Cool. That's all I got.
Thank you.
Very good.
I'm very excited about this.